we continue the second half of lesson number 5 in the miracle of America. And this is the story of the birth of a nation, the American nation. Now we continue our discussion of the Declaration of Independence because the founders said it was a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. We talked about the minorities that sometimes don't feel that way. And we found that in America they can get equal in the way they're treated and so forth faster than about any place else in the world. But we've all descended from minorities and we've all had our tough period, but eventually we make it and we homogenize and we become a great land of equally treated people, and that's our goal and objective as a nation. All right, now the Founding Fathers said that it was also a self-evident truth that all men are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable up at Harvard, and unalienable down at Virginia, Williams and Mary. Anyway, they both mean the same. These inalienable rights include the right to life, and that's the right to continue existing once we come into being. The right to liberty, which means the right to make free choices of what we would like to do. The right to liberty. And then the right to pursue happiness in your own inevitable way. What do you like to do? Do you get a great satisfaction out of a hobby or certain kinds of work? What do you do for happiness? Maybe you enjoy gardening. Maybe that's it. My wife, that's one of her main happiness. She has a green thumb and it really works better than mine. Or maybe you just like to go down and be a surfer and get down to the beach. What do you do for happiness? Everybody has their own dimension, right? Now, when I retired from the university 2 years ago, do you know what people told me? I couldn't possibly be happy in retirement unless I learned to play golf. I hate golf. I'm a lousy golfer. I'm a menace to anybody's country club. But there are some things I like to do for happiness. And one of them, I like to ride horses. Used to jockey as a youngster, as a boy. So I like fast horses. I like horses that'll get up and go so I can feel the wind blowing through my hair. Okay. All right. Now the founders elsewhere indicated something which Jefferson didn't think it was necessary to mention, and that is the fact that you can't have happiness or any security of life and liberty without the inalienable right of property being protected. The right of property. And John Adams felt that when he wrote the Constitution of Massachusetts, he ought to spell it out and include that as the fourth item. So that's property. Well, John Locke pointed out what property really is. You see, some folks say, well, property shouldn't be so important. People are important. Right, the founder said. Property doesn't have any rights. It constitutes the rights of people in the property. That's what's sacred. For example, property represents an extension of your life, your genius, your energy, the very essence of your being. You take a farm that you've cultivated and changed from raw sod, you've harrowed it and disked it and brought forth crops. Somebody comes along and takes that away from you. It's actually robbed you of part of the essence of your very being, your life. Now, the Lord knew that. And John Locke was right. Property is an extension of our very being. And it's people's rights and property that are inalienable. All right. Happiness is your last blank there because property is a very important part of your happiness. Now notice that the founders knew that there were inalienable rights other than those which they had mentioned. And let me just list a couple just to kind of keep them in mind. The right of the people to govern themselves is an inalienable right. And the right of humanity to beget their own kind, that's inalienable. And there's the inalienable right of the freedom of conscience. Conscience. Then you have the inalienable right of self-preservation, which means you have the inalienable right to bear arms. Now, there are two different kinds of rights. Did you get that last one down, bear arms? There are inalienable rights and there are vested rights. Now, the inalienable rights are the ones given by God that cannot be taken away from us without subjecting the offender to God's judgment. Vested rights are the kind that we have created for ourselves to protect the inalienable rights. Let me give you an example. Take the idea of a jury. Now, the jury is a vested right given to you by the Constitution. It's vested. That's not an inalienable right. You could get justice other ways. Under ancient Israel, they did not have juries very often. They had judges, righteous judges. But anyway, in our society, that's been made a vested right. Do you know that the Constitution has over 200 vested rights designed to protect your inalienable rights? It's a great document. All right, the fourth self-evident truth stressed by the Declaration of Independence is the fact that the only reason we have government is to protect your inalienable rights. That's the only reason they have for existing. And Jefferson said that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then it was declared that when any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the inalienable right of the people to bring affairs back within their control and government. The cruelty to which people have been subjected in the past, the torturing, breaking on the rack, all of these things entitles the people to rise up as a majority because they have the authority in their power to change the system and to get affairs back under their control. All right, now the founders said that history demonstrates that major changes in government should not be taken for light or transient reasons. Do you see that? For light or transient reasons. But that when it's as serious as theirs had become, why, they were going to do something about it. And capital G, the founders wanted it understood that the step they were about to take was forced upon them. They had petitioned, pleaded, and endured, but conditions became worse instead of better. And they did not represent a few individuals, a minority, or anything else. They were a majority of the people who had been abused and imposed upon, and a majority has the authority to change the system or bring it back under their control. All right, then the next one is duty. They not only have the authority and right, they have a duty to do something about it. Capital H, they then listed the 26 offenses which the King and Parliament had committed against the colonies. And then we come to the words which could have had the founders hanged if we had lost the Revolutionary War. Listen to these great words. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And last of all came that fatal pledge. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. Now, as many of you know, some of them gave their lives, nearly all of them gave their fortunes, but not one of them lost their sacred honor. And the more I read of their lives, the more I watch what they went through, the greater my admiration for them. We were blessed by having great founding fathers. Now, it's evident from the British law that the step they had taken did constitute treason. And I've explained to you how serious that was to be hanged by the head until unconscious, then while alive disemboweled, then quartered, boiled in oil, and the remnants scattered across the fields, so that the last resting place of that individual will be that of a non-person, his resting place being unknown, unhonored, unnamed. All right? Now, Roman numeral, let's see, we have one more blank there. It was the result of this great effort that we became the first free people in modern times. First free people. What a tremendous thing. Roman numeral 4. Now the founders made their first attempt to write a sound federal constitution. That was interesting. Capital A, they tried to do it before the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people don't realize that. They tried to do it before the Declaration of Independence, so they'd have a constitution. And they had a committee appointed to do it on June the 12th, 1776. But you wouldn't believe what happened. To realize, in fact, how important it was, I ought to just point out to you how many problems they had. You see, the boundaries of these colonies were all in dispute. Can you, I don't know whether you can read it or not, but see it says Virginia up here. See, Virginia and Massachusetts were quarreling over this. And Virginia and Connecticut were quarreling over this. Because the original charter of Virginia said that it should go up this way at that angle. And then these other colonies, you see, they said theirs was to go straight back from sea to sea, and that gave them a claim. They got all kinds of problems over their boundaries. That's your first blank. And that made them quarrel over their charters. And they were quarreling over both foreign and domestic trade between one another. And then there was the problem of defense. Who's going to pay for it? Who has the responsibility of raising the army, etc.? Defense. And then who's going to pay for it? What about the cost? Well, the first draft was prepared by John Dickinson, who had originally opposed independence. Then you remember the king called him a rebel and a traitor after he wrote that nice petition. So he's with us, but he says if we're going to go independent, you've got to have a government as strong as the British king. So he wrote up the original Declaration of Independence very aggressively and strong. That's your blank up there. For 17 months then, the founders argued about it. Capital D, they said, we don't want a strong government. We don't want any more of King George. And so they ended up with one, as you remember, that was very weak. Very weak. That's your blank. With no executive, no federal judiciary, no taxing power, no enforcing power or enforcement power, no power to enforce its decrees. Now, you might think that in view of all of the criticism that we've had of the Articles of Confederation, you'd think that it wasn't good for much of anything, but that's not true. Do you know that 50 provisions of the Articles of Confederation were later incorporated in the Constitution? There were a lot of good things in the Articles, but the structure of government was weak after they scrambled it so badly. So number 5 there is 50. All right? Now, the ratification of the Articles of Confederation was delayed because the smaller states said to Virginia and Connecticut and Massachusetts, until all of you will give up your claim to that western land and turn that over to the government to ultimately become new states, we're just not going to sign. All there is to it. Maryland held out until 1781. Now, of course, we fought the Revolutionary War under this form of government, but it actually wasn't adopted until 1781, and that's why. Now, once the colonists had declared their independence, they had to sustain it by force of arms. And you see, they fought the entire Revolutionary War on the razor's edge of defeat. and that's your blank. Continually on the razor's edge of defeat. Just after the Declaration of Independence, the British prepared a massive attack on New York. And they thought that that would end the war. Because what they did was to bring in Lord Howe from England, the admiral from England, with a massive fleet into New York. And his brother, General Howe, came down with about 33,000 troops out of Newfoundland, out of Halifax, and that's where they started it. Well, actually, it almost did end the war. Washington lost about 5,000 men. That's not for your blank there, by the way. And finally was driven out of New York. He couldn't possibly have held it without a navy, and he didn't have a navy. But instead of going home like he was supposed to do, and like most of his men did, they went down from nearly 20,000 men to 3,000. They went home. Many of his officers just left. Cornwallis, the British commander, he started packing his furniture and putting it on board boat. And then the word came, Washington is moving south. And lo and behold, he was moving down out of New York. You see, he was up here in New York, and he moved down and crossed the Delaware and camped. And it was nearly winter. In fact, it was winter. And so Howe went back up to New York. He left Cornwallis right here, and he said, you watch him. So Cornwallis did. He's just a few miles up there at Princeton. So down here across from Trenton, you know what happened on Christmas night. Washington crossed it, captured 1,000 Hessian troops. And this is the famous picture of Washington crossing the Delaware. I don't think he stood up in the boat, but it makes a better picture. And he got over there, and he only lost 2 men, and that was by freezing to death. It was terribly cold. And he captured Trenton. Now, it was interesting what Howe said to Cornwallis, now you go down and punish him. He's not supposed to fight in winter, you know. It isn't cricket. And so Cornwallis came out of Princeton, and he went down there to attack Washington. And lo and behold, here's Washington over on his side of the river. Big bonfires, his camps are there along the river. And so Cornwallis said, well, we'll get up in the morning and we'll go out and take him after a good breakfast. He got up in the morning, went out there, and guess what? Nothing along that shore but ashes, bonfires. It was just kind of a trick. Washington wasn't there. He'd waited for Cornwallis to get down to Trenton, and then he went on around and attacked Princeton. Then Cornwallis had just left and took it. And so he had double victories. He cleared out all of New Jersey, and then went up to Morristown. It just changed the whole climate of the war. Because of those 3,000 that stood with Washington, then others rallied in due time for the attack on Trenton. All right, so 1,000 is your number there. Now, in 1777, the British launched 2 offensives, one out of Canada and the other against Philadelphia. Now, the one out of Canada here is bringing down Burgoyne from Quebec, you see. Then St. Leger was supposed to come down from Montreal, come down Mohawk Valley here. And we got Howe coming up the Hudson River. They're all going to meet at Albany. And you see that will divide New England off from the rest of the colonies, divide and conquer. But guess what happened? Burgoyne got coming down, all right, this is General Burgoyne, and he got coming down, but Howe didn't come up. And St. Leger was cut off in the Mohawk Valley by American troops. And so the next thing Burgoyne knew, he was trapped. And it resulted in a fantastic capture of 5,700 out of his 8,000 troops. Biggest marching army that they had. Guess who the hero of that battle was? It was a fellow that was a subordinate to Horatio Gates. Now, Horatio Gates should have gotten out there. He had Burgoyne surrounded, and he wouldn't move. His troops just couldn't stand it. They were ready to go. They wanted to take Burgoyne, and Horatio Gates wouldn't move. And so a subordinate general, without authority, stormed out and said to the troops, "Follow me." And they took Burgoyne. And his leg was shot up and badly wounded. He had shortened it an inch or 2 later on. His name was Benedict Arnold. And today in Saratoga, you'll see the statue of a boot. No name, just a boot, representing that slashed, broken leg of a great hero who later lost his way, married a Tory girl, and got his feelings hurt and almost betrayed Washington and his army to the British. Well, that's another story. That's Benedict Arnold. All right. Meanwhile, General Howe had transported 15,000 troops south. Burgoyne had his thing. General Howe was going to have his. And he was going to take the capital. He wanted to come in here and take this marvelous fleet that his brother had brought in, and transported his men all the way down the coast here. And then, as you can see, he came up right through the Chesapeake Bay and attacked Philadelphia. Now, Washington tried to stop him, but he'd been weakened because a lot of his troops had gone up to fight Burgoyne. And actually, he didn't know whether to bring them home or not, because when that fleet went out in the ocean, you didn't know whether it was going to Boston or whether it was coming down, you see. He just didn't really know which way that fleet was going to go. And so actually, when it finally happened, why, he was caught and he lost 2 battles, as you know. And then he had to go into Valley Forge while the British occupied Philadelphia. Well, that was a terrible winter, because he asked the states to send him food. He only had 1/3 of his men with coats, and they had about 2,000 starve and freeze to death that winter. They would have flour, water, and salt, morning, noon, and night for 6 weeks. No vegetables, no meat, no nothing. They even had to go out into the countryside and take what little food they could get from farmers and give them IOUs. That was a bitter time for Washington. So he lost, September the 25th was the taking of Philadelphia, and then at Valley Forge he lost 2,000. Now 3,000 deserted and over 200 officers resigned their commissions. But the capture of Burgoyne in October 1777 persuaded the French that maybe they should get in on the act. And while Washington and his men were freezing to death, you had Franklin over in the court saying to the French, look, we just took their biggest army out. This war is practically over. Anybody that's not in on it now is not going to be in on the goodies. You better hurry. And so King Louis XVI, he grabbed that bait and in he came. 2 big fleets and thousands of soldiers. And so that was the situation there. So a pact was signed with France on February the 6th. Now, there's a very important historical event that often is missed by, and that's the fact that during this time, the British got the Indians in the West to attack all of our American settlements and to not just kill the people, but subject them to terrorism. The women were ravished to death. The men often would have their feet burned off to the ankles. They'd torture them over a period of several days, because there was a belief among some of the Indians that if you tortured a person and it was real cruel, the strength of his spirit during that time of suffering would come into your own spirit to make you a stronger warrior. In any way, they got that going. And fortunately, George Rogers Clark came in and told the governor of Virginia, who was Patrick Henry, he said, let's do something about it. And so he was allowed to have 175 men, and he went out there and he took these British forts that were out there on the Wabash River, out there in Indiana and Illinois way. And later at the peace conference, that was what gave us everything to the Mississippi River, just knocking over those 2 forts. And then George Rogers Clark made friends with the Indians. They were French Indians and, former allies. He said, the French have joined us. Oh, they said, that's different. So they became friends out there. That was interesting. All right. British then is your blank on that one. Your blank. And now we come to J. Clinton decided, since the Howe brothers had resigned and gone home, Clinton decided now that we'd better get our troops all back up here to New York, because the French are on the way. So they came up here toward New York before the French arrived at Rhode Island. And Washington almost headed them off at Monmouth. And so New York is your blank. One of his generals let him down, Charles Lee, so he wasn't able to end it there. Then the British started their great campaign in the South. And I tell you, that was an interesting campaign. This is Cornwallis. And Cornwallis went down along the South, and at first he was very successful because he was able to take Savannah and Charleston and a lot of those main cities down in the South. After he had taken these cities here, down here in the South, Savannah and Charleston, and then he started moving up. And I think one of the interesting things is how he got up toward Kings Mountain right here. Now, he had sent fellow named Ferguson, Patrick Ferguson in there. Pat got up on that mountain. He said, neither the demons of hell nor the Almighty can dislodge me from this mountain. And guess what happened? Them our mountain men came down from Virginia and Kentucky. They not only rooted Patrick Ferguson off that mountain, they sent him to his Creator to make his peace. Well, the next thing that Cornwallis knew, you see, he was being forced back up. He was having to head up to move all of his troops, you see, up here toward Yorktown, up here. Now, that gave Washington his big break. So if he got south and successful, now Cornwallis moved his troops into Yorktown because the British were there to help him. And lo and behold, Washington was able to get word down to the British, rather the French Indies, to have the French fleet come up. And they were able to knock out the British fleet. And so that's when Cornwallis found himself surrounded. Washington marched his men down from New York, and there was Lafayette and Greene and Morgan, and they took him. All right, now that was on the October the 19th, 1781, that Cornwallis surrendered. And I'll tell you, the people celebrated all up and down the land. And the King George tried to condition the English people to continue the fight, but they would not. And finally, they declared that the war was over, American independence was acknowledged, and Washington waited to announce this to his men on April the 19th, 1787, which was 8 years since the Battle of Lexington. Wasn't that interesting? So Washington bade farewell to his men. They had this great celebration. It's all over now. And then after he had bade farewell to his men, he went down and resigned his commission, and then he went back to his home at Mount Vernon. He arrived there on Christmas Day. On Christmas Day. Well, that was a great reunion. Now, it was his intention, of course, to remain a civilian, but everything seemed to go wrong with the American people right after that. They had a terrible depression. That's your next blank. There was rioting broken out. Your first blank is inflation. Oh, it was terrible. The continental dollar wasn't even worth a penny. And then there was a depression. Nobody would invest money. Then there were rioting. Rioting was next. And then the states began treating one another like foreign countries with custom houses between the states. It was awful. And so even New England threatened to secede from the Union. And the European powers, both Spain and England, mistreated and abused the Americans. So I've given you some quotes from Washington here that tells you how discouraged he was about the time that led to the Constitutional Convention that we're going to be talking about at our next lesson. And that's going to be called The Miracle of Philadelphia. The Miracle at Philadelphia. That's an important part of our story.